Welcome back. ANC President Jacob Zuma wants the party to clean up its image ahead of next year's local government elections.
Zuma closed the party's three-day National General Council in Midrand yesterday. The party's seen a drop in membership, which is being blamed on factionalism, infighting and ill discipline.
To enhance the fight against corruption,
shape up or ship out. That's the word from ANC party leader Jacob Zuma when he addressed thousands of delegates at the party's National General Council.
In opening this National General Council, we presented serious and uncomfortable challenges affecting the movement.
The number of ANC members in good standing has dropped from over 1 million to below 800,000 in the last 3 years.
Beyond membership, the ANC also needs to win back all our traditional supporters who have been dissatisfied ahead of the local government elections. We will win them back based on how we conduct ourselves as members and also how we implement the good policies of the ANC.
The NGC has made several recommendations to fight corruption, including a lifestyle audit of all its officials and those in state-owned enterprises.
Civil servants, including those in the security cluster, should be prioritized, periodically rotated from one employment site to another, so as to circumvent growth of unprofessional and frequently corrupt relations with citizens, service providers, and other persons they interact with.
The ANC raised the prospect of its vote share possibly dipping below the 60% mark next year, yet it insists it's not worried. But the emphasis on cleaning up its image suggests the party is perhaps waking up to smell the coffee of growing voter discontent. Pagamile Hlubi, Midrand.
Well, the ANC also wants government to withdraw as signatories to the Rome Statute. Signatories to that statute agreed to establish the International Criminal Court. One analyst says it will be a lengthy and complicated process.
The ANC would have to do a domestic process geared towards enabling it to withdraw from the ICC. To do that, they would need to ensure that the South African implementation of the Rome Statute Act is repealed, and then also that the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces vote to withdraw from the ICC, and only then can the executive submit their notice of withdrawal to the UN Secretary General.
Well, for some more analysis on that story, Dr. Tim Murithi from the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation is in the Newsday studio. Dr. Murithi, thanks for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.
A big decision taken by the NGC, but are we surprised?
We should not be surprised, in fact. I think if we go just back to the recent al-Bashir debacle, there were already indications, and I think shortly after that situation, the government indicated, at least intimated, that this might happen. And if we go even further back to 2012, the African Union had adopted a policy of non-cooperation with the ICC. So I think this was on the cards, and so we should not be too surprised.
It is strange, though, given that when the ICC was first formed, it did receive some support from many African countries, but in fact that support waned, particularly after Bashir was indicted, in fact.
Indeed, that's what happened. There was quite a significant number of African countries. In fact, if you take it on the basis of number of countries per continent, Africa was the largest number of countries came from the African continent. But with the 2009 indictment of al-Bashir, you saw a precipitous decline in the relationship between the African Union and the ICC. And then African Union member states would obviously have followed in that trajectory as well.
What do you make of how the ICC has treated countries on the continent in particular? Has there been a particular bias?
Well, the ICC is a complicated mechanism. There is an assembly of state parties, then there is the prosecutor's office, and on taken in its totality, we currently have 9 country situations, 36 individuals who have been summoned, so to speak, 2 rulings, all from Africa. And this clearly is an indication that this organization, the judicial organization we know as the ICC, is not necessarily, applying the international rule of criminal law widespread to across the entire world. It's in fact seems to be focusing on the African continent. And there are many, many dimensions to that issue that we can unpack, but essentially the case selection has been criticized quite robustly by African analysts, by even independent analysts, that how come only the cases that are based in Africa are being, interrogated? Is Africa the only continent where violent conflicts are taking place? And if we think of Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Yemen, Afghanistan, Pakistan, this is clearly not the case. But what we see is that in all of these other countries I've just mentioned, there are major, powerful players in the international configuration of global power who are not interested in seeing these cases appear before the International Criminal Court. And I can point specifically to the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, the United States, UK, France, Russia, and China.
What has the ICC's response been to that question?
The ICC has maintained the position that it is a purely judicial organization and does not engage in politics or geopolitics. But what is in fact happening is when the United Nations Security Council, for example, instrumentalizes the ICC for political agendas that may not be overt to all that are looking, the ICC becomes a political tool. It needs to actually acknowledge that it's operating in a very politicized geopolitical space, and in fact acquire what I would call political antennae to be able to gauge the situations that it's in. So the ICC has been very consistent in saying that it does not engage in political processes. It's purely working on the basis of legal criteria that has been established in the Rome Statute that established the ICC in 2002.
All right, let's look at this decision to withdraw from the Rome Statute. What will the effect be on South Africa on the world stage?
Well, as your analyst has mentioned just earlier on, it will take quite some time for this to happen. So it is not necessarily a fait accompli, and there are parliamentary processes that have to take place. But in terms of South Africa's standing, well, if we disaggregate that in Africa, in fact, South Africa might be seen to be carrying the torch for the continent and might, in fact, increase its standing amongst African countries and the African Union. And we know, of course, Dlamini Zuma is the chairperson of the African Union Commission in Addis Ababa. So that's a good outcome for South Africa in Africa. In the rest of the world, we know recently with the al-Bashir debacle that the EU, in fact, castigated the South African government for the actions that led to the escape of al-Bashir. So, and it's the same in Washington, which has maintained its consistent, support for what they call an international criminal justice system, whereas, in fact, some of the actions of both the US and the UK, part of this northern, if you will, western bloc, violate international law themselves. So it's quite a complicated situation for one to actually kind of get to grips with.
Are you saying that this could possibly have a positive outcome in that we could have our own African criminal court? What would be the AU's role in that?
That's already happening. That's already on the cards. In June last year, 2014, African heads of state met in Malabo and they issued a protocol establishing the African Court of Justice and Human Rights. And if you look closely at the protocol establishing this court, you will find that, in fact, quite a number of its provisions are cut and pasted directly from the Rome Statute, including the war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and crimes of aggression provisions are virtually word for word almost replicas of what the Rome Statute says. So what you can see immediately is that African leaders will say, look, we have our own court to prosecute international crimes. So we don't really want to see any future heads of state going to the ICC, as we've seen with al-Bashir, Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya, and Gaddafi, the late Gaddafi of Libya.
And in your view, we'll be able to see justice in a court of that nature based on the African continent?
So that's a complicated question because it has provisions. It's going to be a legal body. You are perhaps right to intimate that Article 46 provides immunity to heads of state, which then, would raise questions as to whether this court will actually, prosecute the people that it should be prosecuting, who the assumption there is that the heads of state will be the ones perpetrating the wars in a sense. But I think what we need to be working towards is strengthening the African Court of Justice and Human Rights, and in fact getting it to begin to do the work that it should do. And some form of justice is better than no form of justice. Even if we get lower ranking officials to begin with, we're looking at a long-term trajectory, 10, 15, 20 years, to a point when, in fact, we have a culture of addressing the impunity on this continent, which can be done. We should not be, critical, so self-critical of our own African institutions, when, in fact, international institutions like the ICC are being corrupted by the global power players.
Right. Dr. Tim Murithi from the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. Thanks for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.